Good afternoon, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here with your hurricane outlook and discussion for August 20th, 2012. Start things off by looking at sea surface temperature anomalies, those departures from normal. In the Pacific, we continue to warm things up here along the equator as the El Nino tries to finally make itself official, I guess. Not quite yet, but I think we're knocking on the door to that fairly soon. And that could have an impact on the remainder of the hurricane season in the Atlantic, mainly due to strong upper level winds that come out of the Pacific as a result of all this warm water sitting there. Although things are pretty hostile in the Atlantic as it is now anyway, so if it were to get worse, it would probably just completely shut things down, which is good news for coastal land dwellers, that's for sure. In the Atlantic basin, warmer than normal sea surface temperatures dominate the northwest Atlantic, right up against the coast here of New England, the mid-Atlantic states, and the Canadian Maritimes. That could be a factor if we were to get a hurricane to recurve and hit that area. Right now, no such events are in the cards, it looks like. And the remainder of the Atlantic basin running slightly above normal, but nothing that really jumps out as being too substantial. The main thing that I want to look at, though, is the heat content of the ocean. And we notice that our 94L investigation suspect area, whatever you want to call it, our low, sitting out about here, and it's getting ready to move into this block of higher sea surface temperatures and heat content. This is the area where if it's going to start to develop, it's going to have to do so in that region or it may never get to, and I'll explain what that means here. As we look at the satellite picture, you can clearly see a large, very well developed circulation. It is a good thing that conditions are unfavorable right now, at least instability-wise, moisture-wise. Otherwise, this would more than likely be a formidable hurricane at this point in time. Its main problem, if you will, is the lack of moisture. There's a lot of dry air sitting out here still. I'll show you that in a moment, and that is inhibiting its development. Over here in the Gulf, we do have 95L and this cold front that has come down into the region. This might try to regenerate. Well, I say regenerate. We had TD7 that became Helene. That energy moved inland over Mexico. Some of it moved back out. And now we have this new system, 95L. I guess it would be its own entity. If, for some reason, this is a tropical storm today, I doubt it is, but there is recon headed down there right now to check it out. If it becomes a tropical storm, it would become Isaac. And then this one would be the J storm. I can't remember what that is off the top of my head. So it's a race against this one and this one, although I think this is going to stay disorganized and not have a chance to develop. We'll see. Reconnaissance is on the way in there, the hurricane hunters, and they'll tell us exactly what's going on. Looking at the water vapor, here's what the deal is with 94L. You can clearly see that this dry mid-level air to the north is getting pulled into the circulation, so it chops off the northern half. Convection, the deep shower and thunderstorm activity that drives tropical cyclones, is just not able to develop and sustain. And when it tries to go up, those thunderstorms, they try to go up, that pulls in air from the surface in the mid-levels, and that air is dry, and then it just self-destructs. So until and unless that changes, this will not develop much. Although, folks here in the Lesser Antilles need to be on the watch just in case it does try to strengthen rapidly before it gets there. I doubt it will, but stranger things have happened. You never know. You never say never in the tropics, right? And it will bring a brief period of squally weather, as any tropical wave of this vigor would at this time of year. It's interesting, though, that the SHIPS model, the statistical hurricane model for intensity, does make it a 100-knot hurricane in 120 hours. In fact, it makes it a hurricane, or almost a hurricane, in 48 hours. So it's seeing favorable conditions, but I don't think it is seeing the amount of lack of instability and all that dry air out there. That model kind of missing the boat, perhaps. So it's pretty aggressive with the intensity. Now, the GFS at one time was pretty aggressive with development, but it, along with the Euro, has since backed off the ECMWF model, the Euro, and shows a pretty weak system throughout. Now, this is today's run from 12Z. That means it was based on this morning's observations at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, also known as 12Z or Zulu. And we're looking at the 5,000 foot level of the atmosphere, trying to detect vorticity and organization and intensity of that vorticity. And we see 94L here. This valid tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, Tuesday. And it looks fairly decent, kind of round, decent vorticity with it. Not the most impressive I've ever seen, but it's there. 48 hours out, it approaches the northern Lesser Antilles. 72 hours going over Puerto Rico. And big rain event there for sure. 96 hours, it starts to get tangled up over Hispaniola. Now this is important. Remember I said we're looking at 5,000 feet in the atmosphere. Well, if we go to day 5, it's now sitting over eastern Cuba. Now there are mountains here in Haiti and eastern Cuba that are 8 to 10,000 feet plus in the atmosphere. If we're looking at the 5,000 foot layer of the atmosphere, well, this circulation is lower than the mountains are. So you bet that it's getting tangled up in there, really taking a beating, disrupting the low-level inflow, you name it. So if it were to follow this track to a T, and rarely do they ever be perfect, these forecast models for 5 days, you would run it over a lot of land. And it's just not going to do anything if it does that. It'd be a big rainmaker, and that's not to be diminished in terms of its potential hazard, especially over mountainous terrain. Tropical rainfall can be a big problem, but the odds of it becoming a strong system, wind-wise, are slim to none, as long as it takes this track over land areas. Now, if we look at 500 millibars in the atmosphere, or at 20,000 feet, it's barely even detectable. In other words, the circulation is so weak that it does not extend up to the 500 millibar layer of the atmosphere. And that shows me that in 5 days, contrary to what the ship's model shows, there would not be a hurricane sitting in here, at least according to the 12Z run of the GFS from today. Now that can change, we know that it can, but I just don't see how, unless it can avoid all of this land either to the north or, well, to the south, and you have to have a lot more moisture and energy available than what's there now. Also, we have to take into consideration the 200 millibar level of the atmosphere going higher up where the outflow level is, and look, it's just west-southwest winds cutting right across. Very, very negative for development, so I'd have to put another X for that. So this means at the end, the end game, that 94L has one heck of a struggle in front of it to ever amount to anything, and the system in the Gulf never really gets going either. A very strong upper level trough digging in with shear and negative conditions with that. So, as I said at the beginning, for land dwellers along the coast, and shipping interest too, this is not a pattern that is favorable for development right now, and that's good news for those who live along the coast. Now, 20 years ago, very bad news was brewing up. Again, one of our clients had asked me to talk about Hurricane Andrew, and I thought that was a great idea, some retrospective insight to what happened 20 years ago. And right now, Andrew would have been sitting about out in here in its life cycle. On August the 20th, 1992, it was situated at about 62 west or so, maybe a little bit farther, and about 22 north. So somewhere right in here, and it was still just about 4 days away from taking that incredible landfall and place in history here in southeast Florida. If we look at the advisory, whoops, looks like I have, if we look at the advisory for this time period, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the 22nd, or the 20th of August, 1992, getting ahead of myself, Andrew was poorly organized. Check that out. The air pressure, where is it? Estimated central pressure, 1,015 millibars. Recon went out there, found winds to about 60 knots or so, 1,500 feet above the ocean, but the air pressure was 1015 millibars. And for those of you that know your history, Andrew made landfall 4 days later with a 922 central pressure. The discussion talked about, in the forecast part, that a deep layer ridge was predicted to develop off the southeast coast, and that might start to steer it back to the west. They'd have to wait and see if that happens. And then even though the aircraft was unable to find a center, they stuck with a initial position of around 22 north, 62 west, and 60-knot winds that they say lasted for about 12 minutes while the airplane was out there. And then they talk about how the experimental ships model, and I thought this was interesting, the experimental ship's 92 intensity forecast predicts hurricane intensity in 48 hours. However, we will pretty much stay with our previous scenario for now. And that's where they show the 3-day forecast back then. That's all they went out to, is 3 days. 60 knots, really important now, 60 knots at 2 p.m. on the 23rd of August, 1992. Wait till we get to that date in history here and you see what it actually was. An incredible change coming up for Andrew 20 years ago. And you guys that lived down there and you remember that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So special thanks to Sherry, our private client down in Florida, for wanting to take a look back at this. I think it's a great idea. It can help us learn from what happened a long time ago, now almost a generation ago. Alright, so that's what's happening in the tropics. A lot to talk about, but nothing of any pressing concern, at least for now, and that's good news. Hopefully it'll stay that way. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. I will have another video blog for you tomorrow.